Hello, it's Dean Revell here. This is a presentation I was asked to put together after some discussions amongst a few people about a current situation of livestock not consuming dry pasture even if it was present in the paddock in the really dry time that many of us are unfortunately experiencing at the moment. And the discussion moved on to thinking about what could we do about it, and in particular what was the role that urea could play, urea supplementation, to make better use of low quality dry feed. These first few pictures just set the scene, and I thank Darren Cousins for the photographs and David Blood for the commentary in the text on these slides. But you can see very quickly, just looking at this plant here, it's a buckwandery grass. It's not very appetising. We can almost tell that by looking at it. That grey colour, it's lost by and large the golden colour that it had earlier in the season. It's very difficult to chew and bite off. It takes a long time to break into smaller parts in the mouth and in the gut. Very low in nutrients and especially crude protein. In this photograph we can see a range of different palatabilities of different grasses. Some are not being consumed at all, some are consumed to some extent, and some are being quite heavily grazed. And this highlights the differences in palatability that you can see either between grass species, grass types, or indeed even within the same species but growing in different parts of the landscape. And rather than thinking of palatability as some mystical characteristic of the pasture or the plant, whatever we're talking about, that makes an animal like it or dislike it, although that's true, that palatability is linked to the degree to which an animal likes something. It's not a fixed trait, and nor is it unrelated to the nutrient supply that the animals can get from that plant. So the more nutritious the plant, the more palatable by and large. And conversely, when a plant is unable to meet the nutrient requirements for an animal or is very difficult to consume, then their preference for it can rapidly drop off. And there's some really interesting data around that shows that the less nutritious any feed source is, if animals are presented with that day in, day out with very little choice, then their motivation to consume that plant can really drop off. And that's an interesting thing that I think helps explain often what we see, where animals just, visually at least, are just not putting in the effort to consume the plant material that may be there. It's their motivation, their incentive to consume the feed is really heading down because it's not nutritious and there's no variety. This is the photograph that I think really triggered some of the discussions, that there's feed here, there's dry feed here, there's bulk, but the animals aren't consuming it and are therefore at risk of losing weight. So before we go into some of the strategies and focus on the potential role of urea supplementation, I just wanted to quickly go back to having a think about, well, what's the mechanisms that are playing out here? And I think it's worth us trying to understand the rationale or the reasons why something happens, because we can often see the symptom but not necessarily the cause. And this is an analogy of an animal, and I'll explain the parts later. But first of all, I just want you to think about a challenge of trying to empty a jug as fast as possible into a funnel that drips into a glass with a straw. The aim, as I say, is to empty the jug as quickly as possible, and only two rules apply. You cannot allow the funnel to overflow, nor can we allow the glass to overflow, but you can change some of the components you see in this diagram. So in order to increase the rate of emptying the jug, what are some of the things that you might think you could do? One option is to change the funnel. And even here we've got a couple of options. We can have a larger reservoir at the top of the funnel, or we can increase the aperture at the bottom of the funnel. Now the first option may allow us to pour the jug in a little more quickly to begin with until this reservoir fills up, but the rate at which it drips out the bottom is still going to be constrained by the aperture at its point of exit. The funnel on the right, on the other hand, can allow a faster flow of the fluid through the funnel, and is probably a better option for trying to maximise the rate at which we can pour fluid from the jug into the funnel. So let's go with that for the time being. And then the other part of the diagram with the glass and the straw, what can we do down here to increase our opportunity to empty the jug as quickly as possible? We can get a larger glass, and that would allow us to fill up at least until, to empty the jug, and at least until we fill up the glass. Another option, and perhaps a better one, is to put a second straw into the glass so the rate at which we're using the fluid is increased. And if we're removing fluid more quickly from the glass at the bottom, we can probably pour more fluid into the glass, into the funnel at the top more quickly. So there's an optimal situation that we might settle on. Now, how does all this relate to an animal? The jug is like the feed on offer in the landscape. The rate of pouring the fluid into the funnel is equivalent to feed intake, the consumption of the feed. The funnel is the gut, the rumen, the front part of the digestive tract that houses billions of microorganisms that ferment and break down the feed into smaller particles. The rate at which the fluid was leaving the funnel is analogous to the rate at which digested plant material can exit the gut, move out of the rumen and further down into the digestive tract. The glass is, in a sense, the animal itself. It is able to utilize the energy that is being obtained from feed, but there's a capacity, its genetic capacity on how much energy it can use, and that's linked to the rate of using energy. So if it's a high genetic merit animal that has a fast growth rate, it's like, in this analogy, having 2 straws instead of 1. Or if a cow calves and starts producing milk and her rate of using energy to produce milk increases. So it's a dynamic situation here. The unfortunate situation we are confronted with in a dry time with poor quality, dry, high fibre feed is in fact this scenario, where we return to a funnel that is allowing only a slow rate of exit from the funnel, a slow rate of feed leaving the rumen and becoming available further down the digestive tract. And irrespective of the capacity of the animal to use energy, the animals are in an energy deficient state. We just cannot fill up that glass fast enough under this scenario. So rather than looking at the symptom of low feed intake, we can think about the underlying mechanism here is that animals simply cannot process the feed any faster through their digestive tract, or particularly the rumen, leading to a slow rate of flow from the gut, which in turn feeds back to say feed consumption needs to be reduced. You can't pack any more into the rumen than it is allowing to exit from the rumen. Now, in the short term, the rumen can expand, it can grow, and that happens with high fibre feeds. The scratch factor you may have heard about can stimulate the rumen to expand, and so our funnel, if you like, gets bigger, but that's only a short-term fix. Ultimately, it depends on how much feed can actually exit the rumen. That will set the constraint to feed intake. And the ultimate consequence, as we've already mentioned, is that can lead to an energy deficient animal. So what can we do about it? So to get to a little bit closer to reality and away from orange fluid moving through funnels, let's think about the feed that the animals are being offered at this time. It's high in fibre, it's low in nutrients, probably pretty much all nutrients, but especially in this context, low in protein. And again, for this context, we can use nitrogen interchangeably with the term protein or crude protein. So you'll hear all of those terms in animal nutrition related literature and advice: nitrogen, crude protein and protein. And for ruminant animals, sheep, goats, cattle, by and large, they can be used interchangeably. So when the feed that the animals consume enters into the rumen, it has to be broken down. And as we've said, it's high fibre. It's often long fibre too. The animals might be able to rip off long particles, long physical dimensions to the feed. It has to be broken down. And it's the gut microbes, the microorganisms, often colloquially called the gut bugs, that do that work. They have the enzymes that can break it down. But they can only do that if they're supplied with the nutrients they need, and under the circumstance of dry, high fibre feed in a dry season, they'll almost certainly be short on protein or nitrogen for their own use and that limits their capacity to break down the feed. It takes a lot longer than it otherwise would. So we've really got to think about feeding the microorganisms in the gut. And if we want to supply a nitrogen source, one of the most commonly used nitrogen sources is urea, because it has a high nitrogen content and can be relatively cheap and effective if used well. And that's the subject of what we'll talk about shortly. Without getting bogged in the chemistry, I just wanted to show you what a urea molecule looks like to make the point that when it's broken down by the microorganisms that have the urease enzyme that can split off the two parts of the molecule that contain nitrogen, it very quickly leads to the production of ammonia. An extra hydrogen hooked onto the nitrogen here produces ammonia. Now, the microorganisms are quite amazing creatures because they can use ammonia to build their own protein. Now, that's something that the host animal, and indeed you and I, can't do. We don't have the enzymes in our tissues to do that, but the microorganisms do. And that's why nitrogen is synonymous with protein in sheep, cattle, goats, because of this phenomenon here of microorganisms, in a sense, converting raw nitrogen into protein. The ability of the microbes to do that can be hampered if the energy that they can acquire from the feed is low. So we need to bear in mind that when we have these high fibre, low energy feeds in the landscape, these plants, these dry grasses, or any of the other material that might be available, they can only process ammonia at a certain rate that may be capped by their access to energy. And so we need to be careful of not oversupplying urea and ammonia into the rumen microbial ecosystem. And if we do overload it, that's where the problem occurs, because ammonia is a toxic compound to just about every cell in the body, but especially to brain cells. And that's why an animal experiencing urea toxicity can look confused and stagger and generally not in a good state because its brain cells are not functioning correctly. So to ensure we get the good outcome of converting urea to ammonia to microbial protein, which will then drive the breakdown of the high fibre plant material without leading to an accumulation of ammonia, there's two things that we can do. And one is to be careful we don't supply too much in the first place, but perhaps more importantly is that we introduce the animal, and in fact introduce the microorganisms, the urea and ammonia, at a slow and steady pace so they can adapt. The particular species of microorganisms that can convert ammonia into microbial protein need time to build up their population in that dynamic rumen ecosystem. And if we do it too quickly, we just overload their capacity. So if we do it slowly and in a measured way, it allows that adaptation in the guts to occur, and it can be very safe indeed. A rule of thumb for the amount of urea to provide animals in this situation is 1 to 2 grams per 100 kilos of body weight per day, which of course, depending on the size of the animal, determines the total amount. 20 to 50 grams per day is an indication of where you'll be. And the point of this table here is to show that the concentration at which we supply urea in the mix, the supplement mix, whether it's a loose mix or a block, determines the amount we'd need the animal to consume in order to meet its requirement. It's not a lot of value in supplying less than the animal needs, because we're still spending money on doing it, but it's not getting the production response that we're after. So it can be lost money. If it's a low concentration in the urea mix, then they need to consume clearly a larger amount than if it's at a higher concentration. And it's worth us thinking when we look at these figures, do we really expect our animals to eat 300 or 400 grams per day, or perhaps only 100 grams per day? What's your experience of your animals with perhaps some other supplement that you might have put out in the past? How much were they consuming? Both of these are possible. These amounts are achievable, but not always do they occur. And in terms of how you feed it and how often you put it out in the landscape, you can just use these sums and some simple calculations for the estimated number of animals that will be accessing it at a particular point. You might be putting it out near a water point, for example, that you know there's about 50 head using that water. If you're intending to be out there a couple of times a week, so you can calculate how much is needed to last 3 days, and that's the amount listed here in this set of examples. If you're only getting out there once a week, you'd need to provide more so it lasts for that duration. Now this does bring an important point in that ideally, if you can fit it into your program, is to be offering it as frequently as possible. Daily would be great, but often not practical, but every couple of days. Because you might be able to imagine if you put it out weekly, some animals might come in and consume large amounts and in fact be at risk of urea toxicity. And then in the days that follow where there's none left, other animals that start coming in to use or stick their head in the drum to have a look, there's virtually nothing there. And so that nice steady adaptation for the mob of animals that are accessing the supplement just isn't occurring. We're at risk of some individuals consuming too much and some individuals not getting any. And so smaller amounts more frequently, if it's practically possible for you to do so, is an option worth thinking about. But often we find we've got a double challenge depending on which end of the spectrum the situation is placing us at. We might find that we're having trouble getting animals to eat enough, and so we have to think about what can we do to encourage animals to eat the urea licks or the urea blocks, but at the same time doing it in a way that we don't provide too much or they consume it too quickly. So on that second point, introducing it slowly, 3 basic strategies. We can start with small amounts in multiple drums, increase it steadily when you see a broad consumption across the mob of animals eating it, and try and, as much as you can, have a look and see, is it the same old girls coming back each time, or are you seeing pretty much the broad spectrum of animals inquiring and using the lick in the drums? Because as we've said before, there's no value if there's a stop-start offering where animals may see it for a day or two and then it disappears, it's consumed, and then it's not there for a few days. That's not an adaptation. Second strategy is to start with lower concentrations, build up towards higher concentrations, and most feed manufacturers will be happy to custom mix if you ask for it. We can work up, as I say, from low to high and allowing the animals to adapt. We've probably said enough times now, but just reiterate that it's the total amount the animals are consuming that's important, not the concentration that they're consuming. So if they eat a lot of a 10% mix, it could be more damaging than if they eat less of a 30% mix. And there is some evidence out there that suggests that lower urea concentrations can make the lick more palatable, and in fact they may eat more. So you need to do that calculation and think, well, there's that certain concentration, you're estimating their consumption on average to be a certain amount. How close to that 1 to 2 grams per 100 kilos body weight are they? And you'll be aiming at less than that initially and building up to that over a series of days and a few weeks. The third option is to dilute a higher concentration yourself. Salt's often used, putting salt on the top of the lick. And if you do that, salt acts as a limiter. Just be careful that animals they're very good at being selective and they aren't just pushing through the salt on the top and acquiring what's underneath it and potentially consuming larger amounts than you thought they might have been. If we're on the other end of the spectrum and we're finding they're just not inquiring enough or not consuming enough of the supplement, there's 3 main things I think we can do. One is to make the supplement behaviourally interesting. So this isn't about changing the composition of the lick, but it's to increase the attractiveness of it for animals to come and inquire, put their nose in it, have a snuffle around, eat a little bit, be active in their behaviour. And one of the things you can do is to offer jackpots, which is one of these rangeland self-herding tools, which is offering small amounts of a high value reward that's paired with a really distinctive signal, and a whistle is a good one. And very quickly animals can learn that when they hear that signal, that there's a small amount of something they're going to really enjoy eating. Now, not all animals will access it because we're only putting out small amounts, but animals coming in with positive intent will draw other animals with them. And seeing animals consuming from a drum can motivate other animals to do the same thing. So we're really here about just ramping up their animal behaviour in a positive sense for them to be more motivated to inquire, what's going on here? Why are all my mates coming in? It looks good. What's in this drum? And over time we can trigger a behaviour. Moving them around here is the drums. I'm talking about the drums, not so much the animals, but of course the animals will follow. That if we put out anything, any feed source, a supplement in a drum, and it's not getting adequate attention, we think, well, I'll just leave it there, and the animals will surely, if they need it, they'll figure it out. We'll just leave it there. But when it's static, they can actually lose interest in it and not even inquire. It becomes, as I often say, it's like a fence post to them. It's just a thing. Where what we want to do is pairing it with these high value rewards nearby and keep them moving. Put the drums a short distance away the next time you're out there. If they're getting a lot of attention on the drums, move them quite a long distance away. Might be 500 metres, maybe even more. In a sense, treat it as a bit of a game where the animals have to actively seek them out, but they know it's a good thing and they're motivated to do so. The second option is to make the lick mix nutritionally interesting. Often they'll include molasses either in the mix or on the mix. Molasses might be offered in a liquor roller drum, again containing urea in the mix, or the roller drum may be just nearby. And the benefit of a liquor roller drum is it limits their intake and we're not spending too much on molasses. It's quite likely that animals that are energy deficient and are being offered only high fibre plants in the landscape will find molasses very attractive because it's an energy source that comes without the fibre. So it's very attractive to them, readily available to the microorganisms in the gut, and quite a handy supplement. You just don't want to be mucking around feeding large amounts and spending a lot of money, but using it as a tool to stimulate intake can be quite useful. And the nutritional composition of the lick itself becomes important, and as we add nitrogen in the form of urea, or for that matter in any other form, we need to think about the sulphur content as well. It's very important for the nitrogen-sulphur ratio of what animals consume, as much as it's in our control, to be around 10:1, because that's the proportion that's needed by the gut microbes. So if we add nitrogen, we should also be thinking about adding sulphur in the form of any of these compounds and products listed here. I was asked recently about adding urea to drinking water, and I have to say that my first reaction was one of great caution. I've been concerned about animals over-consuming urea and experiencing urea toxicity. My feeling is actually less cautious now on thinking about it and looking at some of the products that are on the market. But let's, before we go into that, just quickly, there's pros and cons, like anything, of offering urea in drinking water. On the plus side, animals, all animals will get some as long as all animals are drinking. So clearly all animals will need to drink if there's no surface water anywhere, and that's clearly going to be the case in the dry time. So adding any kind of medication to the water ensures that some consumption will occur. The downside on this is that thirsty animals may overdose, and in some cases the additive, including urea, there's evidence of it lowering water intake, effectively reduces the palatability of water, and at least until animals learn that the flavour and the characteristics have changed. But it's a good idea to keep the concentration to less than 2 grams of urea per litre, because the consequences of high urea in water are not good and are exacerbated if you have an alkaline water source to which you're adding urea. It's a pretty straightforward process if you have a water medicator to add something into the water source. So that's definitely on the plus side, balanced of course with a bit of a reality check that until the medicator malfunctions. But there are some good products, as I understand it, on the market now. Adding urea to water, we've just got to be conscious that if it's done in a way that the urea breaks down into ammonia because of microorganisms in the water source, then that ammonia, which is very volatile, can blow off from the water source and potentially just be lost. The other is that if the urea causes layering or forms layers in the water, if the water is not agitated, then animals may hit a high urea concentration layer and be at risk of overdosing if that occurs. And when thinking about this more widely, I came across the Queensland-based company Direct Injection Technologies. I have no affiliation, no ties with the company at all, but was interested to talk to them and find out about their product, and was pleased to hear that they've thought quite hard about the form in which they're presenting urea as the chemical compound, as well as the technology that it medicates the concentration into the water. And these are just some of the photographs that I got off their Facebook page, with the urea solution being injected into the water source with some neat electronics and solenoids and one-way valves that can pick up a change in concentration, and if it goes above a certain level it can automatically shut off. Now, urea is not the only source of nitrogen that we can think about adding into the diet of animals under our management. There's a couple of other options to think about. One is the one that's in the landscape all the time for many of us, and that's the shrubs, whether they're the saltbush shrubs or the mulga type. They're typically high in protein. They're free, they're in the landscape. The question quite often, though, is are the animals consuming them? And that's an interesting point in itself, and something I'd be happy to talk about at another time. But what are the management tools? And I think we have some at our disposal, very practical tools to educate animals to diversify their diet. Now, that's a particularly beneficial thing to do and easier to achieve when animals are well nourished. Contrary to what we often think, that when animals are short on something, they'll seek it out. But they're better able to learn how to mix and match different parts, different plants that are out in the landscape. They're better able to learn how to do that when they're well nourished. Waiting until poor times hit is not a great time to educate animals. So thinking about incorporating appropriate amounts of shrub consumption into the diet of animals can be something for us to plan for in the longer term, to set animals up to better cope with at least the first phase when they hit a dry time. Protein meals or feed, high quality pellets are available, and assuming they're formulated correctly, are a good source of nutrient, and you can expect to see animal responses. Cracked lupins, for those that are able to access those cost effectively, are a terrific source of supplement for animals. They're high energy, high protein. They're safe relative to cereal grain in terms of acidosis. I say cracked lupins for cattle, but if you have sheep, then whole lupins are absolutely fine, and save the money and don't bother cracking them. They'll do it for you. In the case of protein-based meals, pellets or grain, lupin type grain feeding, the issue is not so much will the animals respond, but how much do you want to spend on it? And here I just say that looking at the price per tonne can be misleading. You might be put off and think, well, that's just far too expensive. But looking at the dollar value per unit of protein that's being supplied in a form that the animals can use is really how you should calculate the expense of such a supplementation program. So per tonne expense is not always a good indicator of the responsiveness and the value for money that you may get from it. If we are trying to control their intake in order to control expense, then one option to think about is the use of lick feeders, and I'd really encourage the use of mobile lick feeders. Sure, there's an upfront expense in getting hold of this infrastructure if you don't have it already, but the benefits of a lick feeder at being able to control how much animals eat per day by some pretty nifty but simple engineering that makes animals have to lick it out with their tongue. They can only consume so much before their mouth gets dry and they need to go and get a drink. So you don't put these things close to a water source. You want to put them some distance away. So they eat a bit, need to move away, get a drink, allow other animals in to consume the supplement that you're providing here. Now, being mobile brings in a whole another set of benefits for you. Not only do you avoid overgrazing and a bit of land degradation risk if you just plonk something in the landscape and leave it there, but even more importantly is that we're drawing animals into parts of the paddock that they may not have been using before. And we've seen examples in working with pastoralists that they're getting better use out of paddocks than they were otherwise expecting, because animals are being accessing areas that they weren't accessing before, and the very supplement itself can be allowing them to make better use of the forage that's in the paddock. This little photograph here shows a nifty homemade wind chime where the paddle blows in the wind, a bolt inside the cylinder clangs, signalling to the animals where is the lick feeder when it's being moved around. They know they can easily find it, and it draws them into areas, as I say, that they may not have been using previously. It's a really terrific tool that can be used in many situations. So thanks for listening. Appreciate you getting through to the end. If there's anything I've said here that you'd like to follow up, please get in touch. And until next time, bye for now.